You ask me what I will inherit. You want the easy answer, the kind I would have given you as a child when the glass was half full and full of fairy tales. 3D printed hearts, primordial forests, cars made of sun, bodies on the moon. Back then, the possibilities were infinite. People fell in love over binary codes, slayed dragons with cardboard signs, held bursting galaxies in their hands, and gave them names of their own. If you'd asked me then what the human inheritance was, I might have said magic, or light, or everything in between.
Welcome everyone to this episode of Different Boat, Same Storm, a video podcast brought to you by myself, Abhay, Atharv, and Eli. For the next 3 episodes, each of us will be doing individual deep dives in candid conversation with one guest. COVID-19 is above all a humanitarian crisis, and our podcast is centered around fostering discussion around perspectives and the innate human experiences that often lie in the shadows of mainstream discourse. Every week, same time, different guests, different boat, same storm. This week, we are thrilled to welcome our guest, Eleanor Wikstrom.
Hi.
How are you doing today, Eleanor?
I'm doing as well as one can be.
Yeah,
How
for
are you
sure.
doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. It's definitely an interesting time, and we're so grateful to have you on this podcast. So, Eleanor, you and I go back to about a year from today, actually. Do you want to talk a bit about how we met in that experience?
Yeah, so we were both scholarship recipients of the Rustic Pathways Critical Issues Summit Scholarship, and that was this incredible program that brought about 60 scholarship recipients plus other students from around the world to meet up in Southeast Asia to discuss different critical issues. So Abhay started on the access to water track, which began in Cambodia. I started on the access to education track, which began in Vietnam. And then in the second week of the program, we met in Thailand to talk about the Critical Issue Summit, which was based around design thinking in order to create innovative solutions to some of the problems that we had researched there. So although we came from different tracks and from different countries originally, Abhay and I hit it off in the beginning, and since then we've been keeping in touch. So it's great to be here.
For sure. Thank you for being here again. And Eleanor, your story is it's one that's so captivating. You're a poet, you're an athlete, and you're really passionate about so many different issues. Can you tell our guests just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am from Oakland, California, and a lot of the work that I do centers around the community that I'm from. So one of the biggest things recently is that my term just ended this summer, but I was the 2019 Vice Poet Laureate for the City of Oakland, which means that I did a lot of community engagement with activism in the arts, but also performances in different venues, so at different conferences, running workshops in schools, and stuff like that. I am also involved as a cross-country and track athlete. I ran for my high school for 4 years, and I was named the California Scholar Athlete of the Year for 2020 this past spring.
That's so cool. And so I know recently you actually were told and you had the opportunity to write and perform a poem for the UN, for the United Nations. That's what we're talking about here. Can you tell us about that experience and really how you got that opportunity and how you went about expressing what you felt for the 75th anniversary of the UN?
Yeah, for sure. It was a lot of being in the right place at the right time, so I'm very grateful that the opportunity came my way. I got a message from the filmmaker in early June, and so first I was like, oh, this is probably a hoax. Like someone's like asking me, DMing me on Instagram to ask me if I want to write a poem for the UN. Like, right, of course. But then it turns out he wasn't joking. It was actually writing a poem for the UN. So they went through the program that I'm part of, the Oakland Youth Poet Laureate program, and he had seen some of my stuff online, and so he liked my style. And we had about a week to put together. So I wrote a poem within a week. We put together a recording within another week, and so that was early June. And then June 26th was the date of the official 75th anniversary or commemoration of the signing of the Charter of the United Nations. And I was fortunate enough to receive this opportunity because the charter was originally signed in the Herbst Theater in San Francisco. But there is no Youth Poet Laureate program in San Francisco, so they came to the next best thing. Also, probably the better thing because go Oakland, which was the Oakland Youth Poet Laureate program.
Yeah.
So I was fortunate enough to be able to film that poem that I wrote within the same theater that the charter was signed in, which was an incredible experience, and also just really augmented by the fact that the filmmaker Tim Myers did a really nice job of overlaying different visuals from when the charter had been originally signed, and like overlaying the words of the speakers who had spoken at the original convention. But yeah, and so in terms of what I was writing about, that opportunity came around right when national uprisings about the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement came around. And so at first it was really difficult, especially on such a short time period, to be able to write a piece. I usually don't write poems in a week. It usually takes me like more time of drafting and thinking. And it was hard too because that poem had a lot more of like a global scope, but there was so much going on at home that I didn't feel like I could do it justice, or that I felt like I was detracting my own attention away from things that matter more. Like, why talk about abstract ideas of the will of humanity or something when there's people being murdered in my country?
Yeah.
And eventually I was able to come around and see the parallels between the idea that like evil is continuously arising in human society. Racism is not new in American society, and a lot of those things are also echoed in the past of other countries and imperialism and all of those things. And so it's always been, there's cycles that occur throughout history, but somehow foolishly humans continue to try to fight against it. And I think that's a tragic thing, it's a foolish thing, and it's also a very beautiful inheritance to have. And so that's where the idea for the poem was born, and the poem is called Inheritance.
And that's such a beautiful sentiment, like the fact that evil is so human, and evil will continue to impact all of us around the world. It's not just an American phenomenon we see here in Canada, around the world. And the UN is kind of this testament to this global collaboration, this multilateralism and working together. Can you talk a bit more about how really in today's day and age, as a young person in America, starting university at Harvard actually this coming September, can you talk about what it's been like over the past 6 months really have been such a roller coaster in society? Can you talk about what that's been like for you as an individual and as a part of a broader Oakland community and as a part of the broader American community?
Yeah, definitely. Well, this was supposed to be my high school senior spring, and as we know, that didn't really happen. But there's certain things about the end of your secondary education career that you expect. So when you're a second semester senior, you're at the peak of your educational career. You've done all the hard stuff. It's supposed to be like gradual coasting downhill with a lot of little events along the way, like prom and decision day and graduation, that are supposed to help you mourn the end of the only life that you've ever known. Because I've lived in the same house for 18 years with the same people, generally gone to school with the same people. I've been fortunate enough to stay in the same place for 18 years. And so there's supposed to be some sort of celebration and mourning to have the end of that life, and instead of that gradual downhill is just free fall. So that was a really interesting emotional experience, and a lot of the months blended together, and there's a lot of emotional turmoil. It's kind of hard to figure out how you're going to start the next chapter of your life without really getting closure on the first one. But since then I've learned a lot about how even though my senior spring didn't look the way that I expected it to, that didn't mean that it was irredeemable. Like, we were salvaging parts from whatever we had left, but we were still able to make things that were whole. We were still able to celebrate ourselves and celebrate the end of 18 years, and I mean, from an educational perspective, 13 years of that journey. So in that sense, it taught me a lot about, I don't want to sound cliche, but like really just seizing the moment. There's not going to be normal for a long time, especially considering how great America is doing handling this pandemic. There's not going to be normal for a long time. And so that's part of the reason why I decided not to defer my enrollment, was because I wasn't going to wait for something to be handed to me or for something to go back to normal. I wanted to make sure that I could make the best of whatever I was given, and continue to apply that throughout the rest of my life.
Adapting this to this new normal, it's definitely something that we've talked about with our other guests on this podcast, and it's not something new. Change is often said to be the only thing that's inevitable. It's the only thing that's going to happen. And although these past 6 months of this amazing year of 2020 have been nothing short of normal, it also makes us think about what does normal mean? And as a society, how do we continue to adapt to change? Now, I'm going to backtrack a bit. Eleanor, can you tell us a bit more about as a person, how did you get into poetry and athleticism and all these things that make you who you are today? Because I think that's such an important part of our individual stories that we often overlook. How did we get to our current state?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's always fun telling the origin story. So for arts and for poetry, Oakland has this really cool program called the Martin Luther King Oratorical Festival. And so Oakland, I've been in the Oakland public school system my entire life, and it's very underfunded. It's often looked down on by outsiders. It's largely composed of marginalized communities, and it was originally created to emphasize that like literacy tests for students from OUSD weren't really showing how well-spoken and how thoughtful Oakland students were, just because they weren't doing well on traditional like reading and writing tests, but they could speak and they could orate. So that's where that program originally came from. It's been going on for a while, and every year from kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade, students will perform spoken word or speeches generally related to Dr. Martin Luther King and the work of the civil rights movement. But of course, like, civil rights and activism extend to a lot of different spheres of society, and so it's grown a lot since then. But that's how I began, because it was something that my school did, and so that was the first time that I'd ever seen poetry. I actually didn't really know that there was a difference between poetry that was meant to be read or written and consumed like intimately, where you're just reading it, versus public poetry. And so that's why I got more into the spoken word side of things, was because my first introduction to poetry was that public sharing, that poetry as a tool of activism and as a tool of engagement, rather than just being something to be consumed intimately, which can also be a tool of activism, of course, too, but that was just my original introduction to it. And so that's how I got involved with doing spoken word. And then from there, it went into Poet Laureate and all these incredible opportunities since then. Should I keep going?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so cool to hear how, I mean, it was just this one thing that you got started with. So when you started with this spoken word, what was it about it that, for you personally, that made it so interesting? And I'm trying to understand why, for you, why was spoken word you're calling out as opposed to, written poetry or public speaking or another form of expression?
Yeah. In the beginning, it definitely scared me a lot, and I think that was part of it. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself someone that has stage fright or has difficulty public speaking, but there is something kind of scary about performing poetry in front of a large group of people, and so that's what drew it to me the first place, because I'm kind of competitive like that. It scared me, so I wanted to do it more. Don't always advise that for everybody, but yeah, and then I think once I started, for a while I was like doing published poetry. That's what a lot of the Oratorical Festival is people like doing Langston Hughes or doing Maya Angelou. But when I started writing my own stuff, I think the first time I recited it, there's a certain very visceral response that you get from an audience when you're performing spoken word poetry that you have written, because it is very intimate because you wrote it, but at the same time, you wrote it to be shared. And art is a science. There's certain stylistic choices that you make in order for it to be as emotionally impactful as possible. But spoken word, you have the fortune of being able to watch that take effect in real time, especially if once you step off the stage, people can come to you after and offer their own testimony on how your piece impacted them or how they could relate to it and stuff like that. And so I think once I had that first experience of sharing my own story through poetry, through spoken word, and then seeing how it could form a community and form that, everyone collective breathing, collective storytelling, collective sharing after that one poem could then blossom into a community, drew me to continue to, work with that craft.
For sure. And what I find that resonates through a lot of what you talk about is this sense of community. And community is so important in not only bringing people together and getting things done, but creating some meaningful change that can actually help the people that are in your community itself. So when it comes to community building, how is poetry and spoken word and this expression for activism, as you talk about, how has that allowed communities to form through your work?
Yeah. I think one of the most recent things that I had in this area was I led, right before COVID hit, So literally like the end of February, beginning of March. I led a bunch of poetry workshops at in the English classes for the juniors and seniors, the 11th and 12th graders at my high school. And they were around the topic of cultural organizing, which Abhay knows about because we co-led a workshop on it when we were in Thailand. And it's the idea that as long as marginalized communities continue expressing their culture, forces of colonization can never truly win, because colonization exists to silence narratives and to control the narrative. But once you resist that and continue sharing your own, you can never truly be eliminated. You can never truly be controlled. And so that was something that really resonated with a lot of the students at my school, because again, it's very much there's like 93% Black and brown students at my school, especially in a country where the curriculum is very much whitewashed. Students understood that the history curriculum was not intended for them, but they knew that they had incredibly powerful voices and things that they wanted to share. And so that being able to connect with the other students at my school and my peers and just witness firsthand how much people wanted to share their stories and wanted to write, and even people I had a lot of people come up to me afterwards and say they had never written a poem before in their life, but it was itching to come out of them. I had like an introduction for each workshop that like explained the purpose of art as activism and the purpose of cultural organizing, and like one single example of a spoken word video. So that is like, there was a lot going on for someone who had never been involved with that before. And then I gave 20 minutes to write, and people came up with incredible things just because they were so ready to share.
Right on the spot.
Yeah, exactly. And going through that and reading some of the pieces that people have written, again, I'm just always in awe of the power of the voices of my peers and how poetry could create that sort of expression for people who had never really been afforded that opportunity before.
Wow, it's incredible to hear. Just, so often we think of marginalized communities and youth in particular as not being able to express themselves because they just don't know how to. And I think what you articulate is so well is the fact that when you support people in expressing themselves, when you support them with resources on how to specifically, take their voice and share it with other people, they can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's so awesome to hear. Now, considering that you were doing these workshops up until February, end of February, and early March is when really the world changed. We really know that, and the World Health Organization declared COVID as a global pandemic, and since then it seems like everything has kind of been in flux. Can you talk about that process for you as an individual? I know we talked about this briefly, but going through that astronomical change at a time when in high school you should be celebrating everything that's already come, what got you through that time?
Yeah, so there was definitely a lot of readjusting my perspective and also just what I was looking forward to, because it was like we were losing things one by one and then all at once. So it was like, oh, we're going to be out of school for 2 weeks and then for a month, and then you're not coming back and you're never going to have an in-person graduation. So it kind of it was 0 to 100, but also like incrementally at the same time. And so because of that, I still now don't exactly know what I can look forward to, just because we don't know when things are going to get better enough for in-person events to happen, for those big kind of milestone events, or at least physical milestone events to happen. But it's been helpful to find like the little miracles of every day that you can hold on to. So I've been able to see this time as I get to spend more time with my family before I leave. I'm going across the country, and so this is instead of being like wasted time for things that I have lost. I mean, things were lost, but at the same time, it's not just a period of loss. It's also extra minutes of gifted life to do other things that I might not have been able to before.
For sure. Yeah, I've definitely been spending a lot of time with family. We've been playing Monopoly all the time. I think we've played 5 times so far, my parents, my brother, and I. I lost 4 times in a row, but then I recently just won, so I'm pretty pumped about that. So were those like
the 5-day Monopoly games, like never-ending ones?
No, we've been playing for months. We've been at it for months now. So we started a game on Saturday, and then we were playing until Monday whenever we had free time. And then Monday night, I finally ended up winning, and I was just like, yes. I totally get it. Those are the experiences that moving forward, you're not going to be able to have as you go to Boston, as I go back to Toronto, and as life just continues to change. Now, moving forward, Eleanor, like this, we don't know what's going to happen, as you said, especially in the States when everything is up in the air as cases continue to surge, especially in Florida, especially in California now. I mean, are you hopeful for the future? How do you feel about everything moving forward?
I'm hopeful because I know that I have enough faith in humanity, whether it be foolish or not, that people will step up and that people have been stepping up. Like, I know that we're not just leaving each other to die in a hole. There are people who are making those moves when necessary. And I'm also going to be part of that generation that is making those moves. I am 18, and in the little ways that I can be that person who is making those necessary moves too. So I'm hopeful in that sense, and that I know that there are people working to do the right thing. And while it's not, it would be naive to assume that it's just going to be like, oh, like, don't worry, you don't have to do anything. Everything's going to be okay in the end. And a broader, like, cosmic, having faith in something larger than myself and the sum of all the little parts of all of the people doing the little right things, eventually I know that we're going to get to a better place as long as we put in the work to get there.
Yeah, it's that optimism that you and the other people around you doing positive things consistently will be able to make a better future. Now, you often talk about being a part of that change. And you yourself really embody that in the way that you go out into your community and you strive to help other people. You know, really speaking of that, being in America right now, there's so much going on, and there's so many negative things that are constantly bombarded in the news. How do you deal with all that negativity in the news, and what is it that makes you know that, you know, as a young person, being a part of that change, that change will happen?
Yeah. Well, on one hand, there's definitely an amount of like measured intake that you have to do. I think that to some extent I have a responsibility to pay attention, especially for things like regarding racial injustice and police brutality against Black people, because I am not experiencing that trauma firsthand. Like, I want to bear witness to it to make sure that I can do whatever I can to help lift some of that weight for other people who are experiencing it firsthand. But at the same time, when things coming like COVID, I was reading something the other day about how our like brain intake is getting really messed up because everything seems imminent right now, because we're getting new stuff every day that seems like fight or flight response is necessary. So we're starting to not be able to distinguish, like, there's a pandemic going on, but also like, oh my gosh, I forgot to take out the trash, and oh my gosh, I forgot to set my alarm, and all of them seem like they are very, very high priority. So our brain is getting confused about which ones are actually high priority. We're just getting a lot of like intake right now.
Yeah, that overload.
Yeah, absolutely. But go ahead.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, like, when it comes to that overload, like, I've definitely felt that, especially early on when I'd watch CNN all day. Even though I'm in Canada, I'd still watch CNN all day. I'd watch the Como brothers go at it, and like, I'd also listen to Dr. Sanjay Gupta. I'd listen to Dr. Fauci. All these people come together and give these medical opinions. But at a certain point, it's so much, and you need to know what's necessary. But beyond that, is it really worth it to continue to stay tuned into the news?
It's definitely difficult in America because things are so polarized right now. And I'm also in the Bay Area, which is absolutely a left bubble. I know that my local news and all of those things are not going to be the most, unbiased. And I think there's definitely an art to understanding what you can watch. So, like, recently I've been like watching BBC because I trust the external view of America more than I do the internal right now, because everything's being polarized, because wearing a mask is suddenly politicized. Like, how did it get to that point? It's because we were in our little confirmation bias information bubbles. And so just working on like removing myself from the two sides of polarization that are happening to see if I can, find my way down the middle and keep with the most accurate information, and then in that way having that information to help me then make the decision on what my next steps will be to see how I can help.
I'm really curious what you think about this. A lot of people say moving forward in America, people need to come together, and it's not about being left or right. It's not about being a Democrat or a Republican. It's about coming together and really talking. That's often talked about as what created America as it is, that spirit of going together, sitting around a table and having those hard discussions. Do you think that's happening anymore?
I don't think it's happening enough. I wouldn't be so bold as to say that nobody's doing it, but I think it's also very telling that at like the highest stages of our government, conversations are being stopped purely on the basis of ideological and like party affiliation. Like as soon as something comes in because it was introduced by a Democratic member, it will be blocked by the Republicans in the Senate. And I'm sure, there's also the ideological basis behind it, but because so much has been created about like towing the party line and all of those things, I don't think that that's being modeled very well at the highest level of our government. And I'm not really sure how that's going to look, if it's going to come top down. So eventually they're going to start talking, and then people in the base will learn to start talking to each other, or if it'll be the base that learns to talk to each other first and then be like, hey, you guys need to follow our lead. But I am hopeful that at least the younger generation, although we are growing up within these information bubbles, that we'll also be a little more aware of them than people who did not grow up with technology and do not realize that confirmation bias is embedded into the technology that they're using and consuming. At least we're aware that it's there. And so we have a little bit more of the ability to see past that and hopefully have those dialogues. Because I agree, I think political polarization is very dangerous in America. And it's, of course, it's spreading to other, I wouldn't say spreading, but it's also present in other parts of the world too. But I can, especially because I'm in America, I can see its effects very profoundly.
I'm going to push back on that, though. You say that as youth, we tend to recognize that we have these little bubbles. At the same time, when you look at some of those most pressing issues that we have to take action on, when you look at the climate crisis, when you look at the need for racial justice in America, a lot of youth think that there's no time to talk to the other side, that we need radical change now and we need systemic changes. And that's not going to happen when you have bad faith actors in the system. How do you reconcile those two perspectives? Because I know personally that's something that I definitely have trouble with, like the fact that the climate crisis needs immediate action now. And we frankly can't afford to spend the next 12 years talking about how to make action.
Yeah.
So and at the same time, though, when it comes to coming together and having conversations and really breaking some of those divisions around us, we need to talk to the other side.
Yeah. I think that's why it's a great thing that there's more than one person doing this work, because both of those need to be happening at the same time. Having those conversations is more sustainable, and it will create that change for when we get older, that hopefully our children and their children, unless the world blows up before then, but we'll know to have that dialogue. But you're right, there does need to be imminent action. So there are two sides where some people need to be working on creating those sustainable conversations, but the other people need to be working on like getting that imminent action now, because if we don't take that imminent action now, like what was the point of the conversations if we're all like underwater in 50 years? Yeah,
there's definitely that balance that we need to strike, and it's about, a lot like spoken word. It's that balance, and it's an art and a science of bringing those two things together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I often think that idea of the art and science of things coming together applies to so many things beyond real artwork or real activism. It applies to public speaking. It applies to real science. Like you look at public health nowadays, it's not only the science behind public health, but it's also about how physicians share that information with the public and how it's accepted. Moving forward, though, Eleanor, this is I guess a personal question now. Looking at the world around you and looking at the balance that needs to be achieved when it comes to conversations and action, when it comes to you as an individual, where do you see yourself going, and how do you see these ideals of conversation, about empathy, like kind of what this platform is centered around, having conversations with people from different perspectives, but also being an activist and working to create change? Individually, how do you see that all coming together for you?
Well, that was a great setup, because I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because of course I'm going to school and I'm picking my classes, and although thankfully at Harvard I don't have to declare until the end of my third semester, I want to start thinking about it, and I've I've definitely realized that you're right. Like all of those things, the moment you realize that there is art and science and art and all of those things are connected, you level up. Like you cannot be stopped because you realize what makes things move in the world. It's not just knowing how to crunch numbers, and it's not just knowing how to make things sound pretty. It's realizing that both of those two things together, boom, unstoppable. And so for that, I am really interested in, I would like to be in government because I want to create change on a macro level, and I want to be in the room where the decisions are happening, and make sure that imminent action is being taken. But at the same time, I think it's important to be literate in the world of sciences and in the world of arts, and because we need more creatives in government to create more dynamic change, but we also need more scientists in government to create more sustainable and more informed change too. And so as I am looking at my courses and all of those things, I definitely know that whether it be like formally through my majors and minors, I am planning on incorporating study of science and continued study of art and spoken word and being part of that community, but making sure that it ultimately ends up in a position where that sort of immediate action. So like the groundwork for being able to have those conversations with people in the fields of the science and with people in the fields of the arts are there, but also so that action can be taken because I'm in the right place.
Wow. I swear I did not mean to, I did not have the plan to set it up that way too.
No, it was perfect. I was like, wait, did you read my mind?
and that's the thing, right? I think so many of these things are universal and people feel these ways. People feel that so often politicians are just talking and they don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And at the same time, you see people that are so intelligent and they have such great ideas, but they can't share it to the masses.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important that as a society, we value both things. I with our first episode, actually, we were talking to a professor at the University of Toronto who's talking about how like the arts has gotten us through these times. As much as public health and medicine has been, literal lifesavers for so many people, for everyone quarantined at home without Netflix, without music, without binge watching TV shows. Like, what would you be doing and how would you get through this in a sane manner? So I guess starting to wrap up here, moving forward, how do you see us as a society and as individuals taking care of our mental health, taking care of ourselves, but also taking care of one another?
Yeah, I think this time has definitely been a pause, and I do acknowledge that I speak from a place of privilege and that I'm in a stable household. I'm not dealing with a very severe change in income right now, so I have had the privilege of being able to spend this time as more of reflection, because I don't want to romanticize the condition of quarantine at all. But that being said, I think people are taking a little more time to pause and realize that we've been rushing and rushing and rushing, and now when we are forced to stop, we're reevaluating the things that we really want to be doing and the people that we really want to be with. And so hopefully with that comes a greater collective consciousness that we have been going at this unsustainable rate for a long, long time, and that we need to start reevaluating when all of that is gone, when all of the noise is gone and all of the rush is gone. Do we have everything that we really need? Do we have the people that we really need? And do we have ourselves? Are we really there for ourselves? And so I think a lot of people are coming to different terms with their mental health during quarantine. Being in shelter in place and not being able to have those social interactions has a lot of different impacts on different people. And so hopefully we're taking that time to connect a little bit more deeply with ourselves and see what we need and check in with ourselves. But then also to take a look, once we have had those, you can't help other people if you are not helped. That's why therapy is like generational change. It's because the things that you are internalizing, you will then put on other people. So I'm hoping that everyone will take the time to evaluate themselves and make sure that they are in a good place, because then you can start extending those positive benefits to the other people in your life too, and creating that sort of optimism, improvement from hope yourself out.
For sure, that hope for a better future, and by taking care of yourself, you're able to take care of other people around you. But I think at a societal level too, I think this moment in society has allowed a lot of us to reflect and look at the systems that have gotten us to this place. A lot of these systems are broken, and a lot of these systems need improvement. What do you think this new normal, what do you hope that this new normal will look like as as the American presidential election comes up, as hopefully after a few waves and minimized harm from COVID-19, hopefully after all of that subsides and we enter this new phase where life is back to normal or some state of normal, what do you hope that new normal looks like?
Yeah. I am hoping that people recognize that things are broken and that there's a little misinformation team in the White House that's doing the best that they can to be like, oh, numbers are up just because like testing is increasing. And I think people are starting to see through a lot of those lies. I think a lot of finally this like cult of personality that's at the top, even a lot of the top Republican leaders are starting to break away from that and realizing that like, hey, we stuck with this for 4 years and look where it got us. And so once we are able, we're definitely in the eye of the hurricane right now. So we know that this is not over and that there's going to be a lot of damage when we come out of the other side. Once we get a vaccine, once we can go back to some form of normal, it's never going to be the same. But I'm hoping that this will mean that our healthcare system is going to be a little bit, people are going to pay more attention, that they're going to place more emphasis on at least giving some sort of basic coverage to people and basic unemployment, help and assistance, and same with the systems of criminal justice, because these two hurricanes are coinciding at the same time. It would be a disservice to everyone who has lost something during these times, which is every single person, that if nothing changed, if we came back and there was no movement on institutionalized racism and no movement on the inequalities in our healthcare system, and also the way that those two things, racism in the healthcare system, are addressed too.
For sure. They often say a society and a nation ought to be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable. And looking at how different countries around the world have fared during this time of distress, I think that's something that as a society and as a people we ought to be more cautious about and really cognizant of. Eleanor, thank you for this incredible conversation. We've talked about everything from how you're an incredible leader and how you've led poetry workshops at your school that have really allowed marginalized students to share their voices and to be heard. And it's really shown that despite where you come from, despite your background, you can share your voice and you can do that in such an eloquent way. You've also talked about how you recently performed a poem for the United Nations for this commemoration of the 75th anniversary, was it?
Signing of the charter, yeah.
Yeah, signing of the charter. And you also talked about, we had this amazing discussion on society at large and the balance between art and science and moving forward in the state of new normal. We ought to come out of it together and we're going to be stronger. You're a generational young leader, and I'm so glad I had the chance to talk to you on this show. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abhay. This was a lovely conversation. It was great to talk with you as usual. You are doing incredible things by sharing these stories and making sure that the pandemic is humanized too. And so I applaud you for doing this work, and I'm very grateful that you asked me to come.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This is another episode of Different Boat, Same Storm, a video podcast aimed at humanizing the pandemic, as Eleanor just put it. And we'll be back here every week. Same time, different boat, but same storm.